Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 1, the communication process. So in this lecture, we'll cover the field of communication, the communication process, communication competence, social media, and interpersonal communication. So let's go ahead and get started with exploring the field of communication as an academic discipline. So usually when people ask me like, oh, what do you teach? What do you study? I tell them communication studies, and most people have a difficult time understanding what that really entails. So hopefully this will provide you some information on what we do as communication scholars. So there's a lot of different areas of scholarship that is exploring communication. So communication is foundational to every aspect of human life. And so there's scholarship in all sorts of different fields. So the first field of communication studies is intrapersonal communication. And this really explores how individuals talk to themselves, how our cognition influences our behavior, and how we function as individuals within our relationships and society on a broader whole. Interpersonal communication, which is what we will focus on this semester in this class. Scholarship in this area focuses on dyadic interactions, communication between two people. So this could be in a lot of different contexts. This could be, communicating with a romantic partner, or maybe a parent or an employer. Maybe patient-doctor interaction. So we see that interpersonal communication can emerge in various contexts. Group and team communication is the next area of research, and this explores how groups of people come together and communicate in order to accomplish a task. Public communication is public speaking. So for those of you who have taken public speaking or COM 1, chances are you've probably explored rhetoric, how to structure a speech, how to speak to the public. Organizational communication looks at how organizations communicate internally, so the various moving parts, and then also how they communicate externally to stakeholders and also the public. So again, a very broad area. Mass communication is looking at broadcast messages. So this could be through radio, television, social media, all of those things. In fact, the research that I'm working on right now is exploring how the CDC and the World Health Organization utilized social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram to communicate related information to the COVID-19 outbreak. And so I'm exploring that from a public relations perspective to see how effective those platforms are on reaching the public. So again, there's very diverse studies and approaches to studying communication studies. There's personal and social media. I've done some research on Instagram, specifically Finstagram. So this is where people make a fake Instagram account or a subsidiary account that's separate from their main account in order to communicate more honestly and openly about issues. So again, we see that the social media is changing the way we're communicating as individuals. And then, of course, there's intercultural communication. And we could apply intercultural communication to all of these various areas of scholarship when we have different cultures interacting with one another. So this could be through the media. This could be, maybe someone on your work team or in your group project might be from a different culture, or some of my colleagues are in biracial relationships, and so these intercultural communication can happen in a very intimate context, such as a romantic relationship as well. So hopefully this provides a little bit of context to what we study. Essentially, if you were to ask me, we study human interaction. Why study communication? Well, communication is constantly changing. So with social media, how we engage in conversations, how we engage in relationships is constantly changing. Language and behavior is constantly changing, and we want to keep up with that. We want to know why it is people are doing, saying, communicating the way that they are. So, for example, on fleek was a buzzword a few years ago. I think it was the 15th century equivalent to on fleek is snout fair. So instead of saying like, oh dang, like someone's on fleek, or that outfit is on fleek, you would have said, oh, that's so snout fair, right? So we see that language is constantly changing, vocabularies are being developed, and by virtue of that, we enhance communication effectiveness. Communication is inevitable, so we communicate all the time, whether through our verbal communication or whether it is through our nonverbal communication, such as what we wear, our facial expressions, how we style our hair, if we decide to wear a mustache or not, right? So communication is inevitable. People are going to observe us and interpret our behavior, what we say, what we don't say, as a form of meaning. So there's a misconception that more communication is always better. That is miscommunication because we strive for quality rather than quantity. So the quality of communication influences every aspect of life. So we see that oftentimes the quality of communication is directly associated with relational dissatisfaction and some serious health issues. So later in the semester, we'll talk a little bit about John Gottman and how certain toxic conflict styles within relationships can actually erode the immune system, eliminate T cell developments, which are really important for combating certain cancers. And so when we are in a relationship or in a situation where we're constantly being criticized, where we're constantly being contemptuous, that could actually erode the immune system. So we see that there's that direct connection to relational satisfaction and also our health. Divorce, the last time that I looked at the numbers, it was about 48%. That was a few years ago, so take that with a grain of salt. But we see communication is usually within the top 3 reasons why people end up in divorce. We see that workplace issues often stem from communication issues. And NASA, I think it was back in the early 90s, wasted $123 million due to miscommunication between 2 work teams. And as a result, that cost NASA $123 million over budget. So why do we communicate, right? The textbook talks about 4 predominant reasons why we communicate, and that is to fulfill physical needs. It helps us fulfill identity needs, social needs, and practical needs. So if you've ever taken, an introduction course to psychology, you would probably have discovered this model, and that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And according to Maslow, humans focus on fulfilling these needs. And so the very first needs that we kind of focus on fulfilling is our physiological needs, having water, air, food, sleeping, clothing, all of those things that ensure our survival. Once we have those needs fulfilled, we tend to focus on the next level, which is safety needs. And this is, personal security, feeling safe, could be, employment, making sure we have access to resources, health, property, all of those things. When we have those needs taken care of, then we typically focus on this love and belonging needs or intimacy needs. So we establish friendships, intimacy, families. We become more connected in our community. Once we have established those needs, we move up to the esteem needs. And so we start working in order to build self-esteem, status, respect, recognition, and so forth. The tippy top of this model is the self-actualization needs. And this is the desire to become the most that we can be. And I would argue that even though we strive for a self-actualization, we strive to be the best we can be, I don't know if we will ever reach that point. It's because as soon as we reach that level, there's always something else we could start working towards. And this is something that I've experienced in my own life. So after grad school, I thought I was done with school, but here I am pursuing the PhD. Okay, so physical needs, some of the communication benefits of fulfilling our physical needs is improved life satisfaction and physical health, promotes stronger relationships, and we see that, again, stronger relationships decrease some health risks associated with coronary disease. We see that socially isolated people are 4 times more likely to experience the common cold or be susceptible to that. We see that college students in committed relationships experience fewer mental health problems. And this is, I think, an important key. So having those solid friendships or, those people we can trust and go to when we are experiencing those difficulties during our academic career is really important. That helps us promote mental health. Close relationships offer opportunities for meeting physical needs such as touch and intimacy. Again, having that sense of connection to someone. Identity needs. So this is interesting how communication influences our identity. So identity is established through interacting with others. In fact, some theorists argue that without social interaction, we can't develop identity, a sense of who we are as an individual. And so this is reinforced through this social comparison theory by Fitstinger. And we'll talk about social comparison theory later on in the semester, but that's essentially where we gauge our performance or who we are as individuals based on our surroundings and the individuals around us. And so we allow those external people or the people around us to influence our identity. So in chapter 3, we will revisit this. Identity is communicative. So think about your identity and what you value and how you communicate that through your actions. Maybe it's what you choose to wear, how you communicate, your language, the vocabulary that you use, and so forth. So identity is a communicative function as well, and communication allows us to communicate that identity. We see social needs. Communication's primary way in which relationships are created. It's a no-brainer. You can't formulate a relationship without talking to someone. Communication is critical for developing social satisfaction as well as companionship, affection, intimacy, and a sense of control over our lives. The practical needs, essentially, communication allows us to achieve instrumental goals and resources such as job effectiveness, being able to secure those resources according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go through this. This is being recorded, so you could always rewind, if you needed to re-listen to something. So I'll be brief, as this is supplementing the course reading. So this is the transactional communication model. This is the model that the most comprehensive model we have to describe interpersonal communication. So while there are different models out there, this is the most comprehensive. And it looks pretty intimidating, but it's pretty straightforward. So what we have are the 2 communicators, which are in these little blue circles. And so this is you and, let's say, another person. And we send messages through a channel. Now the channel represents the means by which we send a message. So think about all the different ways you can send a message. Think of how I'm sending this message now. I'm recording it and I'm uploading it to Canvas and you get to view it, right? So it's very linear. It's also mediated through technology. But if we were in a face-to-face interaction, we would be using a real-time face-to-face channel. I could email you a message. You could, email me. I texted a friend earlier today. I made a phone call the other day to a family member. Think about historical perspectives, smoke signals, carrier pigeons, right? All of those are examples of channels, radio broadcasting. So there's a ton of different channels we can use to communicate. Some theorists in the past, Marshall McLuhan, specifically argued that the channel becomes a message in of itself. And what did he mean by that? Essentially, the channel that we use to send a message influences the impact of that message. So the best example I have is thinking about ending a relationship over a text message. So if that's ever happened to you, if you ever done that, the reason why it sucks so much is because it was mediated. It was a text message. It was almost disrespectful in a way. So the channel becomes another layer to that interpretation on the receiving end. The squiggly marks are noise, so we'll talk about that. There are 3 types of noise. There are physiological noise that could influence, how we send and receive a message. So sometimes, students are sleepy or they're hungry, or, maybe you have a stomach ache, or just, your body isn't feeling well. That can really distort the way we interpret messages. In fact, when I'm sick, like, I have a hard time communicating, it's like all I want to do is sleep. So that's physiological noise, like bodily noise. Then there's psychological noise. And so this is more cognitive noise. So sometimes we have insecurities, or we're preoccupied thinking about that upcoming meeting, and we aren't really present or paying attention to the conversation in the present. Maybe right now when you're watching this, you have a million things that you have to get done, and you're thinking about them, and it's probably difficult to pay attention. That could be an example of that psychological or cognitive noise. There's also external noise, and this is just loud environment. So, sometimes we work in a loud environment that makes it hard to hear, or so forth. The oval shapes, which are titled environments. So we have A's environment, B's environment. This is just like everything that you as a person bring to an interaction. It's your cultural background, it's the way you view reality, it's your values, your thought process, personality differences, how you interpret things. So we bring all of that into a conversation, and that essentially puts a lens over how we interpret and interact with people. And so when 2 strangers come together and communicate, they have to create a shared sense of meaning. And so if I were to come up and say, hey, your outfit looks snort fair, that's probably not part of your environment or your context. And so you're probably might have a difficult time interpreting that. So you might say, dude, like, what's snort fair? And then I would explain it, and then we would have shared understanding of that term, right? And so we create overlap. And the longer we're in a relationship and communicating, the more overlap and shared meaning we can create with another individual. So how do we define communication? I use Julia Wood's definition. She defines communication as a systemic process in which individuals interact with and through symbols to create and interpret meaning. So essentially, we interact with and through symbols. The primary symbol we use is language to create and interpret meaning. So we're constantly interacting and creating meaning. So on this slide, this is just discussing some of those elements in that transactional model. So we have the sender, the person sending a message, and they have to encode it. So encoding is essentially when a sender consciously attaches meaning to symbols to create a message. Essentially thinking, how are you going to communicate that message. The receiver is the person receiving the message. They're the decoder. They have to be able to interpret that symbol to create an understanding of the message. And that's why if you've ever talked to someone who doesn't share your same language, there's a big disconnect. It's hard to communicate. It's because those individuals do not operate from the same code system or the same language. And so to be able to effectively communicate, we want to make sure that the way we encode a message will be decoded in the receiver accurately. The channel, as we discussed earlier, is the means by which a sender uses to send a message, and noise is anything that affects the message. So I did talk about types of noise. The three are external, physiological, and psychological noises. Here are some examples taken from the book. So what are the insights from this transactional communication model? Well, we are sending and receiving messages simultaneously, typically when we're in person. And so I could be speaking to you and, well, not right now, but if we were in class, I could be speaking to you and I could be interpreting your facial expressions, right? So whether you're conscious about them or not, your facial expressions is a form of feedback. You're sending messages to me while I'm speaking to you. So it's simultaneous. So this happens in synchronous communication, which is real-time communication, typically in person. Asynchronous communication is usually mediated communication. So this whole semester we will be doing, online. So we're taking an asynchronous approach, right? So I'm going to record a video, upload it, post it. You can watch it on your own time, right? I can't see how you respond to this. Vice versa, you might send me a message and, at like 10 o'clock at night, and it's like I might not get it until the next morning when I check my email. Right, so asynchronous communication is usually mediated communication with some sort of time delay or time gap built into it. Think of Snapchat, Okay, so meanings exist in and among people. People assign meaning to their communication, and communicators negotiate their shared meaning. Environment and noise affects communication. So the environment, this is the physical location, the personal experiences, the cultural background, values, and perspectives that people bring to an interaction. All of that can influence that communication process. Overlap occurs when communicators have commonalities that can help make sense of each other's behavior. And so I always tell, people, like, especially if they reach out for advice in terms of like conflict or arguments that they're having with their partners, this is one of the first things that I offer. It's like, set up an environment that is conducive to have a productive conversation, especially if you're having, an argument with your partner. So it's like choosing the time of day, don't launch into a huge argument when you're frustrated, tired, hungry, or you got to pee really bad, is because that's going to probably put more pressure on that communication interaction. So it's like you want to choose maybe a physical location that's quiet, that's calming, that, both individuals can talk about these, their differences in a more productive way. Channels make a difference, as we see. So mediated communication, this is technology. Have you ever received a text message and you just sat there trying to figure out like how to interpret it? Like you didn't know if they were being sarcastic, rude, or sassy. It's like, yeah. So computer mediated communication or communication mediated through technology makes it harder to interpret that. That's why some brilliant person created emojis, right? These videos, I'm not going to show them, but there's a funny video by Key and Peele. However, in Canvas, you can download this PowerPoint presentation and click on the links to view some of these videos to add some additional context to what we're covering. Okay, so communication principles. Communication is symbolic, so that means there's arbitrary connections between language and behavior. We see that it's transactional, so it's mutually influencing, independent behaviors uniquely created. All of that happens in a transactional process. Communication can be intentional or unintentional. So meaningful communication is always intentional. We really think about what we're going to say, how we're going to say it, and what are the possibilities of this message being misinterpreted. Oftentimes we just communicate without really thinking about it. Communication is irreversible. So once we send a tweet or send a message, when we verbally speak a message, we can't take that back very easily. So once it's out there, it's out there. So one of my mentors, she would always say, taste your words before you spit them out. And that was a reminder that she had for herself to really think about, like, what am I saying? Is this going to, help provide growth in someone's life, or is it going to speak life into someone, or is it going to demean them, be disrespectful and degrading? And so I invite you to do that, to always remind yourself, taste your words before you spit them out. Communication is contextual. So again, communication happens within context. So this is a cultural context, a situational context, and also the relational context. We see that communication has two dimensions. There's the content, which is the actual message, like what I'm saying to you. But then there's the relational dimension. And this is the feelings behind the message. And so with this, it probably feels like a huge disconnect. So you're getting the actual message, but the feeling behind it might be diminished because of, it being recorded and posted to Canvas. So what makes communication interpersonal? So there are a few elements that distinguishes between impersonal and interpersonal communication. So this has to be uniqueness. So this is governed by the nature and history of a relationship, not by social rules. So, maybe you're talking to your barista at the coffee shop, right? That conversation is usually influenced by social norms, like, how you conduct yourself in society. And chances are, the relationship you have with your best friend and the way you communicate with them is very unique. It's unique to you and your best friend. Interdependence, this is where both persons are connected to each other in a meaningful way. So, for example, the barista at Starbucks, like, you could replace them with anyone to make your cup of coffee, but could you replace your best friend easily? Chances are probably not. So there's a lot of interdependence within these relationships. Self-disclosure is another key feature that distinguishes between interpersonal and impersonal conversations or relationships. And so self-disclosure is just sharing important information about ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, and so forth. And then the intrinsic rewards we get for being in these relationships. So rewards that are personally satisfying. Interpersonal communication enhances satisfying relationships. We get a sense of, feeling like we're accepted, we belong, we're connected. And where we don't necessarily have that when we're at the doctor's office scheduling our next appointment. Or when the dentist has their hands in your mouth and they're asking you all those awkward questions, right? Okay, so communication competence. Communication competence is communication that is both effective and appropriate. So effectiveness, we communicate in a way that produces satisfactory results. It's appropriate based on the context, so we don't say anything, do anything that might be disrespectful. So both are equally important, engaging in interpersonal dyadic interactions. I wish I could tell you that there was a formula to develop more competent communication in your everyday lives, but really competence is situational. So what is effective and appropriate in one context might change significantly in the next context, right? And so while texting, your best friend like, hey, what's up? That might not be appropriate or effective when you're emailing me regarding a question, right? So competence is situational. The cool thing is competence can be learned with exposure. So competent communication is identified with some of these elements. A large repertoire of skills. So again, building up our skills. Adaptability, being able to quickly adapt to new surroundings. Ability to perform skillfully. Involvement, being actively involved in developing our skills. Empathy and perspective taking. So being able to identify emotionally with other people around us and take their perspectives, we can develop our communication competence. Some other things include cognitive complexity. So this is the ability to create different perspectives and frameworks for viewing an issue or situation. So it's essentially thinking outside the box, thinking about issues or topics or things from different perspectives. And when we allow ourselves to do that, we see a different picture and we can adjust our communication appropriately. Self-monitoring is paying attention to our own behavior and the way we are communicating, and the willingness to adapt to social settings. Okay, so self-monitoring, a little bit about this. We see that there are high self-monitors and low self-monitors. So high self-monitors are individuals that are very attentive to their personal behaviors, to what they're saying, how they dress, and so forth. And these individuals are skilled at tailoring their communication behavior and image to best serve their goals. As a result of that, high self-monitors tend to report experiencing feelings of intimacy sooner. They're more likely to date many different people and feel less committed to their partners. Low self-monitors, on the other hand, desire to be themselves despite the social situation. So they're less adapting. They're more authentic to themselves. They don't change their communication behaviors. They're less likely to misrepresent themselves. So on the extreme ends, high self-monitors might be interpreted as flaky, is because, they're constantly changing their communication patterns based on the situation. Whereas low self-monitors are pretty constant straight across the board. And so they're less likely to misrepresent themselves. The trade-off with being a low self-monitor is that sometimes these individuals can come off as insensitive, rude, or have a difficult time adapting to their surroundings. However, they tend to develop deeper and more trusting relationships with others. I think, again, because they aren't misrepresenting themselves. So this is the social media and communication. We see that when we are in face-to-face situations, there's an abundance of nonverbal cues that add clarity to verbal messages. So when you're in a face-to-face interaction, you can see how people respond to your message. And so that is a very rich context in terms of communication. A lean context, or the leanness according to this model, is when messages are sent that carry less information due to the lack of nonverbal cues. So again, just that text message without any emojis makes it harder to interpret the emotional meaning behind that message. So social media is, getting to a point where we are able to create a rich environment. But then again, it could also be deceiving as well. So we'll touch on that a little bit later. So this last little bit of this chapter looks at some random stuff about social media. So again, this video, the innovation of loneliness, really touches on something that's important. This is research by Sherry Turkle. And In her research, she's finding that we become so dependent on technology and social media that we are depriving ourselves of developing empathy. And so her argument is that when we fill our, every waking moment with distractions such as social media, like last night, I was I was scrolling through social media until like 11:30 at night, and it's like that's time I could be sleeping, right? But think about those quiet moments in your life where you distract yourself from boredom by engaging in technology. Well, according to Sherry Turkle, it is those very moments in our lives, such as boredom, when we're stuck with our own thoughts, those are the moments we discover more about ourselves. And if we deprive ourselves of learning about ourselves or really sitting in our emotions and thinking to ourselves, we have a difficult time developing empathy. And so this brief video touches on that. Another thing about social media, it's so pervasive in today's society that it's easy to develop this mean world syndrome. And this is a term that was coined by George Gerbner, who described a phenomenon whereby violent-related content of mass media makes viewers believe that the world is more dangerous than it actually is. And so Gerbner developed cultivation theory, and the mean world syndrome is a byproduct of that. So cultivation theory states that the more time people spend living in the television world or in a mediated context, the more likely they are to believe social realities portrayed on television. And so if you only consume news from one network, then chances are you're only going to view the world from that perspective. There's a lot of research on cultivation theory, more specifically to communication studies, framing theory. So how news is framed shapes the way people interpret those situations. Okay, so chapter 1 review, we talked about why communication is important, the 4 basic human needs, characteristics of communication. We discussed the transactional model. We talked about competent communication and also social media and communication. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.